started. We definitely will talk about many interesting things here today. So we have the pleasure today to have here with us Emily Leach. She works at Ethos Privacy. So welcome, Emily.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me today.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. Emily is the privacy content director at the Ethos Privacy. And Emily, how did you get involved with data privacy?
Well, back in 2008, I started working for the kind of straddling the publications and marketing teams at the IAPP, International Association of Privacy Professionals, for people who aren't aware. And I worked on that publications team for 11 years before joining Ethos. So all of my privacy knowledge, I have the IAPP to thank for the 11 years of an amazing experience. It was great. So,
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, for those who don't know, my name is Marcio Katz. I'm the CEO of Get Global International. We are a data privacy consulting company with operations in the US, Europe, and Brazil. This is our data privacy podcast. And today we're going to talk about the US states' privacy regulations, all those pieces of legislations that are popping up almost every month.
yes.
As far as I know, there are 5 different states with data privacy laws enforceable already. California, Colorado, Virginia, Utah, and Connecticut. Is that right?
So yes, there are 5 that have been approved and signed by the governors. They're not all currently enforceable. Right now, we have California, the original California law, I should say, CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, that went into effect a couple of years ago. So that's in place. However, the revised version of that law, which is the CRPA, is not yet enforceable. That comes into effect January 1st of next year, 2023. And then the other 4 come into play somewhere in 2023, a couple in July, some in January. So yeah.
Okay, my mistake. So they are not enforceable. Actually, they were signed. Just one of them is enforceable, the California Consumer Privacy Act, right?
Exactly.
So I imagine that the companies are getting ready and working on how they would comply with those piece of legislation. Well, let's start with California. Just give us a little bit background about California. You mentioned 2 different data privacy legislation. So what are they about?
Yeah, sure. So particularly for US companies, California's CCPA made a huge splash. It's really the first time that US companies that operate only in the US have had to address significant privacy issues outside of there are certain regulated industries like healthcare and finance who've always had to deal with those things. But for the most part, this is the first comprehensive privacy law that the US has seen. So CCPA was a very big deal. It provided rights to consumers, so the right of access, the right of deletion, and the right of portability, and also the right to know. So to know how companies are using your data. It was really the first time that any U.S. specific companies had to deal with that, and the first time that U.S. Citizens had received any of those rights. And of course, they're only allocated to California citizens. But yeah, that was a pretty big deal for everybody.
Yeah, as far as I understood, we have worked on some projects that we had to deal with the CCPA and the European General Protection Regulation. I assume we can say that they are not alike, right? CCPA doesn't follow, it's not a GDPR-like regulation, it's a different standard. What's your opinion about it?
Yeah. One more thing I just want to clarify. I missed a huge right, which is the right to opt out of the sale of personal information. So I want to just add that one in there. But yeah, it does approach privacy differently. The European concept of privacy is that it is a human right. In the United States, that's not the way privacy is approached, data privacy. So there's kind of an interesting fundamental difference there. One of the ways that you can see that in how this is how both regions have legislated is that in Europe, there are legitimate legal bases upon which you have to process personal information. So there are 6 legal bases under GDPR: consent, performing a contract with the data subject, legitimate interests, vital. I'm spacing on the term, but life or death situations, basically. That is
execution of contract and so on. Okay.
Exactly. So that is not the case in any of these state laws that we're seeing. We are seeing for the first time that you need to have a specific purpose for processing personal information, but there is no requirement that you have a legal basis upon which. So the U.S. still is kind of coming at it like you can process personal information however you need to process it. You just need to identify a purpose. But there's no, in Europe, it's much more like you can't process it unless you have a legal basis to process it on, right? So it's just kind of a different.
I agree.
Yeah, a different direction to come at it from entirely.
Yeah, but some people say that the biggest difference between both legislation is that one is opt-in and the other is opt-out. I usually say that that's not quite right, because when you analyze the general data protection regulation, the only legal base that it's opt-in is the consent, but that's just one legal base. The other 5 legal bases, it's opt-out, because the processor has the right to process. And if you don't want to, you can argue and you can show why the processor doesn't have the legal base to process the personal data. So I think the right way to say is that it's the way that you explain it, that there are 6 legal bases and you gotta fit in one of them at least.
Absolutely, right.
One of them is opt-in, but 5 of them are not.
Right,
so
and then you have that right to object that counteracts those other 5 legal bases, right?
Yeah,
for sure.
Because we work helping company in changing the way they process personal data, and we usually say that try to draft your data privacy program not based on consent, because it's more expensive to manage it, and strategically you can get a no as an answer right away. So if you have 5 other legal bases to keep processing the personal data, try to work with the other legal bases, and the consent would be the last option.
I 100% agree with you. And to add on to that, it's incredibly fragile once you have it, right? Because if you're doing GDPR right, not only have you given someone the right to consent, but you've also given them the right to withdraw your consent. And that withdrawal needs to be just as easy as it was for them to give it. So the minute they choose to take it away, you're toast, right? You have no more legal consent.
So that's why I say that it's more expensive to manage the consent, because you can get a consent for some things, but not for other things. You can get for a period of time if you don't have the consent anymore. So I think it's more risky and more complicated.
Absolutely.
But what's the difference between the CCPA and the CRPA, this new Californian data privacy regulation?
Yeah, so there are a few more rights that are offered to data subjects. One of which is the right to rectification. Right, this is a GDPR concept as well that that CCPA has adopted, and it's not in CCPA. And then on top of, so currently in CCPA, California consumers have the right to opt out of the sale of personal information. CPRA expands that, so they also have the right to opt out of the sharing of personal information. And then another one of the huge changes is that in CCPA, there is not the concept of sensitive personal information that gets a higher level of protections. In CPRA, there is a new category of personal information referred to as sensitive personal information, and consumers have the right to limit the use of that. So it is still an opt-out, unlike in the GDPR, right? Using sensitive personal information requires express consent, whereas in CPRA, it's an opt-out. You have the ability to limit the use of that. So that's another huge difference. One other big difference that occurs when CPRA goes into effect is that it will be applicable to employee data as well. So CCPA exempts employee data, and CPRA includes employee data. So that's going to be an operational challenge for a lot of companies, for sure.
Yeah, I feel that with the CPRA, California moved a little bit, toward to the GDPR standard.
For sure,
right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Okay, great. Well, we've heard a lot about California because it's one of the biggest states in the U.S. But as we mentioned before, 4 other states already have a data privacy legislation. Talking about Colorado, what is this legislation look like? I mean, is it more? Does it look like more as a CCPA legislation? Did it come with some other things that you can't find in the CCPA? So.
It did. So there's a right to opt out of targeted advertising and profiling in the Colorado law, and it also came out with the right to rectification. So those are a couple of things that are different in that. It also is more like GDPR in that it requires opt-in consent for the use of sensitive personal information. So it definitely it's I feel more consumer friendly than California, or really some of the other laws that have come out, for sure, in those rights. But a lot of, it has access, portability, deletion rights for Colorado consumers. So it still mirrors a lot of the similar rights that are and obligations that are in the California laws as well.
And from the business side of this whole thing, have you seen companies looking for consultants to help them to comply with those laws, or they are just waiting a little bit to see what's going to happen? How is the market?
Yeah, so people are definitely trying to understand these new laws and how they impact their business. If a lot of companies that we work with either are already complying with GDPR and or are already complying with CCPA. And so really understanding what's the net impact, right? So what's different that we're going to have to operationalize that we haven't already, or we aren't already working on. So that's definitely something that we're seeing, really starting to ramp up here. We do have, there's rulemaking capabilities for attorney generals that will create, like CCPA, for example, has the Attorney General regulations that came out that made some significant differences.
Well, it's a 60-page regulation, right? So
Yes.
I imagine that a lot of change that
Yeah,
that might have happened.
yeah, it
Mm-hmm.
definitely turned some heads, some of the things that came out for sure. So we do, while we have the signed laws, Virginia had a few amendments already to it since it was passed. We may see some more of that come in other states. We do have some rulemaking that we're expecting to come down the line, and that will really help companies understand, how they're expected to operationalize these things. And, it's anybody's guess whether they mirror what the California AG is saying or now the CPPA is saying or not, right? Those are all up in the air questions at this point.
Yeah, I think it's getting complicated as it is for companies to deal with data breach, that you have like 50 different legislations
Yes.
on data breach in the US, and data privacy is taking the same path, I guess. We are going to talk about if that's the right path for the US to take. But first, we want to understand, all the
Yeah.
differences between those states. What about Virginia? Does it bring anything like different from the others?
Not a whole lot different. It's more consumer friendly. Business friendly in its
Hmm.
carve outs, I would say. There are, but the same rights exist. Deletion, similar actually to CCPA, is only for information that you collect directly from the data subject. So personal information that you were to get from, say, a data broker, for example, that does not fall under the scope of the deletion requirement for either Virginia or California. So that's an interesting thing. Whereas for Colorado, and Utah's the same way, excuse me, for Colorado and Connecticut, it's any information that you have collected about that person rather than from that person. So that's another interesting just call out to make on those
Yeah,
laws.
that one changes a little bit, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
any
Yeah.
information related, to that person, it changes the whole spectrum of
Yeah,
how you're going to deal with it.
for
Do
sure.
you feel that companies that are already compliant with the GDPR, they would have like an easier job to comply with the state's legislation? How do you see that?
Yeah, I definitely think so. GDPR is a stronger, stricter law. It is more consumer friendly. So in a lot of ways, the things that you're doing for GDPR will apply for these U.S. state laws. And particularly if you're doing ROPAs, records of processing activities under GDPR, you will have a really great foundation to start to make sure that you can comply with these other laws, because that's kind of the foundation of all of this, right? Understanding where you get your data, what you do with your data, who you share it with, how long you keep it, all that. And that all should be contained in your ROPAs. So if you're doing that for GDPR, that gives you a huge leg up on any other privacy law, data protection law that you have to comply with. I would say additionally, on top of what GDPR requires, there are really like prescriptive things. For example, the opt out of sale and sharing. You have to have a button on the homepage of your website, right? So these little pieces that are kind of how you operationalize these larger concepts. I think in those areas, companies are going to have to do some work, but for all intents and purposes, if you're doing GDPR, you've got a real good solid foundation for these laws. Yeah.
Yeah, at least with our clients, and at least with those who, those companies that have operations in the US and Europe, the way we structure the program, we start from the GDPR, because
Mhm.
as you said, we feel that, it's a stronger data protection
Yes.
legislation, and from there we start, trying to allow some things that it would probably be allowed under the GDPR, because at the same time, any data privacy professional needs to keep in mind that it's not only about complying with the data privacy legislation. We need to make the business running. So we need to find the balance between both things.
Absolutely.
Because if we were just looking at the data privacy regulation, we would say, oh, follow the GDPR and everything's going to be fine. But your competitors will have some advantage on processing personal data under the state's legislations, because they allow things that the GDPR wouldn't allow. So I just wanted to add that comment, because I know that most of the people who are following us and will listen to us or are listening to us right now, or will listen to us in the future, I think that's a way to think and face these kind of situations. Get Club International has this name because our slogan is that data privacy nowadays is global, because it is. So global companies, international companies, they have to deal with a different data privacy legislations. And sometimes you need to have like a global data privacy program. So you need to come up with a solution and decide, how am I going to deal with this whole thing? One of the ways is, start from the GDPR, and then you are going to manage the other issues depending on the state that we are talking about, right? I have one more question here. Are the other states going to have like a privacy authority as California already has, like a data privacy authority?
From my understanding is that the attorney generals will be, and you know what, I'm not 100% sure on that, for that on all of them, but is that the attorney generals will be the enforcement body for these, the rulemaking authority. I don't know that any of them have that set up for an external
I'm pretty much sure that California has a data privacy authority.
Yeah,
And
this is CPPA, yes.
Yes, and I want to know how they will work together, because two different bodies taking care of the same thing. There is a saying from where I come from, that once a dog has two owners, they might not be fed, because one will think that the other one fed the dog, and the first one won't, and the dog won't eat. So I don't know how it's gonna work. Have they regulated that?
No, I haven't seen any coordination between the states as far as how they're going to enforce. I mean, we may see that down the road. There hasn't been a whole lot of discussion about enforcement. I think everyone's just still trying to wrap their minds around what these things mean and how do I do this. So I think it'll certainly be interesting to see going forward how they interact with each other. And, of course, our kind of de facto privacy regulator in the US is the FTC. So to see if that has any, if there's any bearing there on what they might be doing as well. So.
Yeah, we mentioned the general attorneys, the data privacy authority, and the Federal Trade Commissioner. So now we're talking about three different governmental bodies to take care of the same issue.
No dogs are gonna eat.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know.
No, it's interesting. I feel too, right? When the EU started drafting the GDPR, one of the main reasons was because they had a similar problem that the US is getting itself into right now, right? Is that while they had the directive, it still allowed for a lot of leeway in how different member states were implementing the directive. So so one of the goals of GDPR was to harmonize that, right? To create one law for the whole region, so that it was easier for business to happen, and it was much more clear for individuals to know what their rights were, et cetera, right? So that's something that they were attempting. Whether they were entirely successful or not is, up to everyone else's opinion. But I'm sorry, there's a truck outside. I think the U.S. is kind of getting itself into a similar situation here with all of these different state laws. And it'll be interesting to see what happens, right? Because we do now have a proposal on the books. Well, I guess technically not. It's a discussion draft for a federal law that's getting a lot of traction, and so we'll see if we might get some change there in harmonizing some of this stuff.
Yeah, because after the three first states, as we said, the two other more have passed and signed a data privacy regulation, Utah and Connecticut. I feel that both states, they didn't bring much things differently than the other three, right? But things, became a little bit more confused, because every time that you add a different state, that's something that will make things more difficult, right, for the
Right.
companies. So
Absolutely. And it's just like, I mean, it comes right down to this deletion thing, right? A few states, you delete anything you have about a consumer. A couple states, you delete only what you get from them, right? And those, do you have to have the do not sell button on your website, or don't you? It's all those little bits and pieces that that are really challenging to manage.
Yeah, I'm a European and a Brazilian data privacy lawyer. I have helped with the Brazilian government in drafting the LGPG, the
Mhm.
Brazilian GDPR, and that was one of the things that we had to debate during the time that we were debating the bill, and I feel that the U.S. Will have to address these matters that we are pointing during our conversation here, and so that's why I'm making some questions like, how is it going to work? Is it clear who is going to be responsible for this or that? So I feel that those questions are the questions that the Congress is starting to
Mhm.
make, because companies are bringing to them different situations that they already have to deal with, and it seems that it will get worse if we don't have a more comprehensive or even a federal
Yes.
legislation law on data privacy. Have you been researching things and in gathering information on how the Congress is dealing with this new proposal?
Yes, so I have been reading up on that. It's been a pretty interesting time, because there have been proposals over the years. I mean, dozens of federal privacy law proposals. This is really the first one that has both bipartisan and bicameral support, which is why it's they're making a real. I mean, everyone's pretty excited, right? This is the first time it really feels like, oh my gosh, this could be real. So I think that's pretty exciting about it. I think I agree with you that industry is concerned, right? We now have 5 state laws. We could have significantly more than that very shortly, and the type of compliance headaches and what regulator and all the questions that you're asking, I'm sure are questions that businesses are asking themselves in this same situation, right? So and I guess the two main sticking points for federal legislation have always been preemption and a private right of action. Interestingly enough, there is a private right of action in this proposal. It's limited, but there is one, and And the preemption provisions in it are very specific, right? So so what they're looking at basically is to preempt anything in the state laws that the current law covers, right? So so they would preempt CPRA and the Colorado law and the Virginia law. They would not preempt more specific things like education privacy rights, or it actually specifically calls out the Illinois Biometric Privacy Act as something that it will not preempt. So it's rather specific in its preemption. Would not preempt HIPAA or GLBA. So it will significantly help companies.
Yeah, and it couldn't be a more GDPR-like regulation, because we got to remember that the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, is a regulation. It's not a law. That means that it brings the standard, the principles, but each country is allowed to legislate in some on some topics. So
exactly.
it would be basically the same thing. This U.S. federal law would bring like the principles, the standard, but I feel that the states would be able to legislate on some specific topics. So it's pretty much the same thing. I feel that there are two different pressures that are working in order to make this federal legislation become a reality. I think the first one is the industry that is already showing how difficult it's going to be to deal with these matters, and the other one is Europe, because we know that we are going to, I think it's the third agreement between the US and Europe, and every time that they sign an agreement, the European court says that it doesn't work. It doesn't bring any kind of level of security to Europeans. So I think they already understood that, don't come up with any agreement that doesn't make sense, because the outcome is going to be the same again.
That's
it's going to be, there will be a third lawsuit. The decision is going to be the same. And
Max Schrems is going to swoop down. And
I mean, he's making his name, on this thing. I mean, but and not only Europe, we got to remember that many other countries, they follow this GDPR-like standard. So that means that the US should have an agreement with all those countries, because one of the principles of the GDPR, this standard, is that you just make international transfer with countries with the same level of security when it comes to data protection. So if you feel that the US don't have the right legislation to protect the individual's right, that means that they should have an agreement with different countries, and that's going to be a little bit difficult.
Yes, I agree, and I think this will go a long way to showing that that the U.S. Respects the data rights of individuals. I think that it's a huge step in the right direction as far as effectuating those cross-border data transfers. One interesting thing about this law this bill that's discussion draft is being real talked about is that it doesn't cover the government. So it does not address surveillance reform, which of course is one of the big issues with the Schrems 2 case, and has basically made the last two agreements moot point. So it doesn't do that, though. Biden has talked about other ways of doing that. So I do think it's a huge step in the right direction, and I think hopefully it will kind of grease the skids for us to get an agreement that sticks for a little while. That would be nice.
Yeah, so we'll see what's going to happen for those who are interested
Hmm.
on the transatlantic data privacy agreement. Our first episode was on this
Okay.
topic, so I encourage everyone that wants to dive a little bit on this topic to listen to the first episode. So tell me, what do you see for the next month? What do you feel like it's gonna be, uh, for the next month?
Yeah, so the next month is actually a pretty big deal for this federal legislation. In November, we have new elections. So there's a decent likelihood that there could be a change of power in one or the other of our chambers of commerce of Congress. So if that happens, it could potentially change the outcome for this bill. So I think everyone in the privacy community is really cheering on getting this done before the August recess, so that we can call it a good. But I do think so. There's going to be a lot of negotiating, and there's going to be a lot of finger crossing, I'm sure. And but there's a lot of broad support. There's a lot of bipartisan support for pretty much everything in there. So, I think there's reason to be hopeful for sure.
Yes, I do agree with you. But on the other hand, there are so many domestic and international issues that the US has to deal with right now. The shootings, inflation,
Hmm.
war going on, that I feel that these topics is not getting the attraction that it should. So if it doesn't, if they don't
Yeah.
pay attention on this matter, probably those are the reasons why it doesn't move forward. But anyway, we gotta wait until then. We have a lot of work to do because we gotta
Hmm.
help companies to comply with all these data privacy legislations popping up every month. So Emily, thank you so much for being with us. It's been almost 40 minutes that we've been talking. It goes fast.
It sure
So
does.
yeah, it is. Especially when we have the pleasure to have people who are passionate about data privacy, and we definitely feel that you are one of those. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me. It's been really fun talking with you about this.
Okay, great. So everyone, next week we're gonna be here again with a new episode. So take care and see you then. Bye bye.